They laughed at the black man sitting quietly in the back row of the courtroom. A nobody. A spectator. Someone's relative, maybe. They mocked him. Right there. Out loud. And then he stood up. And the entire courtroom went silent. Because the nobody in the back row was the director of the FBI. And he had been listening to every single word. The fluorescent light above courtroom 7B buzzed like a dying insect. It had been buzzing for 3 weeks. Nobody fixed it. Nobody ever fixed anything in the Millhaven County Courthouse. Not the cracked plaster bleeding brown water stains down the east wall. Not the broken thermostat that kept the room 12 degrees too cold from October through April. And certainly not the culture that had calcified inside these walls like limestone. Hard, old, and indifferent to the softness of human lives pressed against it. Marcus Avery felt the cold first. It reached through the fabric of his dark blazer, past the Oxford shirt beneath it, and settled against his skin like a wet cloth. He'd been sitting in this chair for 47 minutes. He knew the exact count because he'd watched the second hand on the courtroom clock complete 47 full rotations, each one a small meditative exercise in patience. The kind of patience that had been trained into him not by choice, but by survival. He sat in the back row of the public gallery. Not because he had to, because he chose to. There is a particular kind of power in choosing to be invisible. His hands rested on his knees, still. He was a large man, 6'2", broad through the shoulders, with the kind of physical presence that some men spend their whole lives trying to project and others are simply born carrying like an inheritance. His face was composed in the way that faces are composed when their owner has spent decades mastering the art of revealing nothing on the surface while every instrument inside is running at full capacity. 9:04 a.m. And what he was watching made something cold and precise harden in his chest. Not anger, not yet. Something older than anger. Something that had a name, but he rarely said it aloud. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something. Right now, before this story takes the turn it's about to take. Drop a comment below and tell me, what country are you watching from? Because this story crosses borders. It crosses languages. It crosses every line people use to tell themselves that what you're about to witness only happened somewhere else, to someone else, in some other place far from where they live. Tell me where you are, because in a few minutes, you're going to want to talk about this. Now, back to courtroom 7B. The man at the center of the proceeding was named Darnell Washington, 26 years old, formerly employed as a shift supervisor at a logistics warehouse on the south side of Millhaven. Graduate of Millhaven State University with a degree in supply chain management. Son of Patricia Washington, a school librarian who had been sitting in the front row of the public gallery since 7:45 a.m. with a Bible in her lap that she hadn't opened but kept both hands pressed flat against, as if she could feel the words through the cover. Darnell stood at the defendant's table in a suit that was slightly too large for him. Borrowed, Marcus noted, from someone bigger. The sleeves fell a half-inch past his wrists. The jacket pulled at the shoulders when he moved. He had the look of a man wearing someone else's armor and hoping it would still protect him. He'd been charged with felony obstruction of justice and aggravated assault on a law enforcement officer. The charge had grown, like mold, from an incident 6 weeks earlier in which Darnell Washington had been pulled over at 11:17 p.m. on Route 9, driving a 2019 Honda Accord that he owned outright. His registration was current. Warrants. His insurance no prior criminal record, not even a parking ticket. The reason for the traffic stop, as written in the arresting officer's report, was suspicious driving behavior, failure to maintain lane. Darnell's dashcam footage, which his attorney had submitted into evidence, showed him driving at precisely the speed limit, in his lane, with both hands visible on the steering wheel. What had followed those flashing lights, in the 12 minutes between the initial stop and the moment Millhaven PD dispatch received the call about an officer in distress, was the reason Marcus Avery was sitting in the back row of courtroom 7B on a Tuesday morning in November, watching the temperature of a room drop lower than its thermostat could explain. The two officers at the center of the case sat on the prosecution's side of the gallery, off-duty but present, a presence that was itself a message. Officer Dale Pruitt was 41, thick-necked, with a jaw that seemed to be perpetually clenched around something he was deciding whether to spit out. His partner, Officer Kevin Morse, was younger, 29, with the kind of blonde, unremarkable face that blended into beige walls and beige thoughts. They weren't in uniform. They wore civilian clothes. But they carried themselves in uniform. That particular posture of institutional authority, the slight forward lean that says, "I belong here more than you do." They had testified the previous Thursday. Marcus had read the transcripts. He'd read them 3 times on the flight from Washington, and once more in his hotel room the night before, sitting at the small desk by the window while the city of Millhaven lay spread below him in its ordinary darkness. The transcripts made his jaw tighten in a way he'd trained himself to manage. Not because the lies were bureaucratic lies of men who had never been required to be creative with their dishonesty, because no one had ever seriously challenged it before. Pruitt had testified that Darnell had been aggressive from the moment of contact, that he had refused to comply with lawful orders, that when Pruitt had reached for his arm to safely assist him from the vehicle, Darnell had struck out with his left elbow in an aggressive motion that made contact with Officer Morse's forearm. Morse had corroborated every word. The dashcam footage, Darnell's dashcam footage, had shown something different. It had shown Darnell, hands raised, asking in a voice so measured and careful it ached to listen to, "Sir, can you tell me why I've been stopped?" It had shown Pruitt leaning into the window, his voice a low, deliberate thing that didn't rise to a shout, but had a quality worse than shouting, a flat, contemptuous certainty. It had shown the moment Pruitt opened the door without warning, without cause, and the physics of what happened next. Darnell's arm catching the door frame as it swung, Morse stepping forward. The brief, chaotic collision of bodies that Pruitt would later describe as an assault. It had shown everything. And yet, here they were. Darnell's attorney, a woman named Cynthia Park who was good enough that Marcus had looked into her background before coming here, had filed 3 separate motions to have the dashcam footage admitted as the primary evidentiary record. 2 had been denied by the presiding judge. The Honorable Raymond Calder, 63 years old, 31 years on the bench in Millhaven County, a man whose chambers were decorated with photographs of himself fishing with 3 consecutive Millhaven police chiefs. The 3rd motion was what today's proceeding was about. Marcus watched Judge Calder enter the courtroom at 9:51 a.m. Calder was a small man who walked like a large robes swishing around his ankles, his silver hair swept back with the kind of precision that announced that he had always been taken seriously and expected to continue being. He settled into his chair at the bench with the ease of a man sliding into the seat of a car he'd driven for 30 years and knew every rattle of. His gaze swept the courtroom in the practiced, imperious way of a man conducting a visual roll call. Prosecution table. His eyes lingered here with something that was not quite a smile, but carried its warmth. Defense table. His gaze moved on with the efficiency of someone checking a box. Public gallery. A brief, dismissive survey. His eyes passed over Marcus Avery without hesitation. Of course they did. Marcus was wearing a blazer, not a suit. He had deliberately left his credentials and credentials-adjacent accessories, the pin, the lanyard, the particular quality of business card that people in certain rooms recognized immediately, in the inside pocket of his overcoat, which was folded on the seat beside him. He had a coffee cup from the vending machine in the courthouse lobby. He looked like an observer, a community member, perhaps, someone's cousin, a man in a back row. He watched Judge Calder not see him, and he noted it. The way he noted everything, with a precision that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with years of practice at the particular discipline of seeing clearly when every instinct trained into you by the world says to look away. Cynthia Park stood. She was compact and deliberate, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses she wore pushed up on her forehead like a second set of eyes. She moved through her argument the way a carpenter moves through a familiar task. No wasted motion, no flourish, just the clean application of skill to material. Your Honor, the defense renews its motion to admit the dashcam recording in its entirety directly contradicts the arresting officer's testimony on 4 specific points, each of which forms a material element of the charges against my client. The exclusion of this evidence. Ms. Park, Judge Calder's voice had the quality of a hand placed firmly on a shoulder, a physical interruption dressed in courtesy. We have covered this ground twice. With respect, Your Honor, the previous rulings addressed the footage's authentication, which we have now satisfied through the manufacturer's verification letter entered as Exhibit 14E. The chain of custody. The chain of custody remains contested. By whom, Your Honor? The prosecution has not filed a response to our authentication documentation. A small pause. The prosecutor, a man named Gerald Finch, assistant district attorney, with the particular brand of comfortable authority that comes from having never lost a case in a jurisdiction where the fix is rarely required to be subtle, shifted in his chair and managed to convey, through the precise calibration of his posture, that he found the entire proceeding slightly beneath him. Mr. Finch, Judge Calder invited. Finch rose with the unhurried ease of someone who already knew the outcome. Your Honor, the people maintain that the footage's integrity cannot be guaranteed and that it came from the manufacturer, Cynthia Park said. The temperature in her voice dropped half a degree. The manufacturer verified it. Bit by bit. What more? Ms. Park, Calder again. Firmer now. You will wait to be recognized. In the back row, Marcus Avery slowly set his coffee cup on the bench beside him. He watched Darnell Washington's shoulders tighten inside his borrowed suit. He watched Patricia Washington's hands press harder against the Bible in her lap. He watched two officers, off-duty, exchange a glance that was brief and small and communicated something that had look at the documentation Cynthia Park had submitted and watched the judge's expression do something subtle and revealing. It didn't harden with consideration. It settled with conclusion. The conclusion had been reached before the documentation was read. The documentation was a formality in a proceeding that was also a formality, and everyone in the room understood this. And the understanding sat in the air of courtroom 7B like the smell of something that had been sealed in too long. The motion is denied. The words were simple. 3 words. They fell into the room the way a stone falls into water. The first impact, and then the ripples, and then the closing of the surface as if nothing had entered at all. Cynthia Park stood very still for 3 full seconds. Then she said, Your Honor, I would like to note my objection for the record. Noted, Calder said, with the tone of a man noting that it was raining while sitting inside, warm and dry. What happened next took 11 seconds. Marcus counted. From the prosecution side of the gallery, Officer Dale Pruitt leaned toward Officer Kevin Morse. He did not lower his voice sufficiently. In a room with marble floors and plaster walls and the particular acoustic quality of spaces built in 1947, a voice not sufficiently lowered carries. What Pruitt said was, they keep bringing in these. And here he used a word that had its own particular history, its own particular weight, pressed into it by centuries of deliberate, systematic use as a weapon, as a diminishment, as a door slammed in a face. He used it casually, the way you use a tool you've always had in the drawer, thinking a phone camera is going to save them. Morse made a sound that was half laugh, half breath. Pruitt glanced at the back row. He saw Marcus Avery. He registered him the way you register furniture. Present, background, irrelevant. He turned back. Marcus did not move. Happened in his chest. Did not change not the cold thing that had been there since 9:04, not that. Something that had mass and momentum, like a very large, very slow thing that has been leaning against a wall for a long time and has finally decided to step away from it. He reached into the inside pocket of his overcoat. He removed a single item. He held it in his right hand, loosely, with the easy familiarity of a man handling something he has carried every day for more than 2 decades. He stood up. He was not a man who needed to clear his throat to be heard. He was not a man who needed to raise his voice. He had learned, in rooms far more consequential than courtroom 7B, that the most powerful thing a voice could do was arrive at its full authority without effort, like a door opening, not being forced. Your Honor. 2 words. But the room felt them. Judge Calder turned from the bench papers he had already begun shuffling. The universal judicial signal that a proceeding is concluded and the judge has moved on before the people affected have been given time to breathe. He looked at the back row. He saw a man in a blazer. He saw, and Marcus could read this with the clarity of someone who had been seen this way his entire life. Exactly what Calder expected to see. A member of the public. A nuisance. Someone's relative, perhaps, who didn't know the rules of decorum in a court of law. Calder's face arranged itself into the expression of a man who was about to explain the rules. Sir, this is not an open forum. If you have concerns about the proceeding. Marcus Avery, Marcus said. He opened the item in his hand. He held it up. The fluorescent light above courtroom 7B caught it. The metal caught the light and threw it back. A small, flat, unmistakable star. The badge. Not a local badge, not a county badge, or a state badge, or any badge that spoke only of jurisdiction bounded by county lines or state borders. The badge of the federal director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The silence that followed was not the ordinary silence of a room waiting for the next thing to happen. It was the silence of a room in which everyone present had just experienced the same sudden, vertiginous reorientation. The moment when the figure in the background resolves into the subject of the painting. When the quiet man in the last row turns out to have been the person the entire proceeding was always going to be about. Dale Pruitt's face went the color of old chalk. Kevin Morse stopped breathing. Visibly. Completely. Like a man who has just stepped on something that might be a mine and is calculating the weight of the next decision. Gerald Finch, the assistant district attorney, set his pen down on his legal pad and looked at it, as if the pen might offer guidance that the rest of his faculties currently could not. Judge Calder sat very still. For the first time in 31 years on the bench in Millhaven County, Raymond Calder looked at a man in his courtroom and felt something that was entirely unfamiliar. He felt uncertain. Marcus Avery walked forward. He moved through the gate that separated the public gallery from the well of the court with a quietness that was not timidity. He moved the way water moves through a space, not forcing, not asking permission, simply occupying the territory that physics dictated was available. He stopped in the center of the courtroom. He was equidistant from the bench, from the defense table, from the prosecution table. He stood in the geometry of the space as if he'd measured it. He looked at Judge Calder. "My name is Marcus Avery," he said again. His voice was the same as it had been before, level, unhurried, carrying the particular resonance of a man who has never needed to shout to be heard in any room he has ever entered. "I'm the director of the Federal Bureau since 9 o'clock this morning, in my capacity as a federal officer investigating a pattern of civil rights violations in this jurisdiction." He let that sit. He let it sit the way a piece of evidence sits on a table, not explained, not argued, simply present for examination. Then he looked, briefly, at Officers Pruitt and Morse. "I've been sitting 8 feet from you for nearly an hour," he said to them. "I heard you. Clearly." Pruitt opened his mouth, closed it. The word he had used 12 minutes ago now hung in the air of the courtroom with the specific gravity of something said in front of a witness. Not just any witness, but the kind of witness whose testimony comes with a federal letterhead. "Your Honor," Marcus continued, turning back to the bench with the measured patience of a man who has decided exactly what happens next and is simply giving the room time to catch up. "I'm going to need to speak with you in chambers. I'm also going to need the court reporter to retain the full transcript of this morning's proceedings, including the last 11 seconds before I stood." He paused. "My office will be in contact with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division before 5 o'clock today. I would strongly suggest that any decisions made in this courtroom this morning be considered very carefully in light of what I've just said." He reached into his blazer pocket and produced a card. He walked to the bench and placed it in front of Judge Calder. Not handed, placed. Set down with the precise formality of a man who has thought about every gesture in a high-stakes room and chosen each one deliberately. Then he turned and walked back to his seat. He picked up his coffee cup. The coffee was cold. It had been cold for 20 minutes. He drank it anyway. In the way that people in pressure-filled rooms reach for familiar things. Coffee cups, pen caps, but to occupy the hands while the mind does the thing it needs to do. The courtroom had not made a sound in 45 seconds. That is a very long silence. Cynthia Park turned slowly in her chair and looked at the back row. She had been practicing law for 14 years. She had learned, in those 14 years, to maintain a professional composure that did not crack in front of clients, in front of juries, in front of judges who dismissed her motions with the weary patience of men who had long ago decided where things stood. She looked at Marcus Avery. He met her eyes. In that exchange, brief, wordless, charged with every weight that the morning had accumulated, she understood several things at once, and felt the particular sensation of a person who has been pushing against a locked door for a very long time, and has just heard something inside give way. She turned back to face the bench. Darnell Washington had not moved. He sat at the defense table with his hands folded on the surface, and if you didn't know what to look for, you might have read his stillness as calm. But Marcus, watching from the back row, had been reading stillness for 26 years, and what he read in Darnell Washington's body was not calm. It was the particular stillness of a person who has learned to make themselves very small and very quiet in the presence of power, because that has always been the safest available option. Marcus knew that stillness. He had worn it himself. In other rooms. In other courtrooms, other hallways, other spaces where the air was thick with the unspoken agreement that certain people were the subjects of proceedings, not participants in them. He had worn it until he had decided, one specific day, at a specific hour, in a specific moment he could still locate precisely in the geography of his memory, that he was done wearing it. That decision had cost him comfort, and the frictionless passage through rooms that opens up when you play by the rules that certain rooms are built around. It had cost him the approval of men who gave their approval only to those who needed it, which meant it had cost him nothing he actually wanted to keep. And it had given him, after years of grinding work, after choices that required him to be right not just most of the time, but always, because the margins given to him were different from the margins given to others, the badge in his right hand, the office in Washington, the authority that was, right now, the most expensive thing he had ever brought into a courtroom in a blazer and a coffee cup from a vending machine. Patricia Washington was staring at him. He didn't look at her directly. Not yet. But in his peripheral vision, he could see that she had taken her hands off the Bible in her lap, and that she was holding herself differently than she had been when he walked in. Less braced, as if something in her spine had been allowed to unknot one vertebra. That was enough. For now, that was enough. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at the buzzing fluorescent light above the courtroom. He looked at the water stain on the east wall. He looked at Dale Pruitt, who was now studying the floor with the focused intensity of a man who has discovered that the floor is the most interesting thing in any room. He thought about a boy, 12 years old, south side of a different city in a different decade, walking home from the library with 3 books under his arm. He thought about what it felt like to be stopped by 2 men with badges. He thought about the particular, specific education that experience delivers, not the kind you find in textbooks, but the kind that enters through the skin and lodges somewhere between the sternum and the spine and does not leave. He thought about what you do with that education, or whether you learn to carry it the way you carry the heaviest things, not in the hands, but distributed across the whole body, manageable, part of the architecture of what you are. He had chosen the second thing. It had taken him most of his life to understand how. Judge Calder cleared his throat. The sound was small and strange in the silence of the room, like the first crack in ice, not the moment of breaking, but the signal that the breaking has become inevitable. We will, Calder began and stopped. Began again. We will take a brief recess. He said it carefully, the way a man speaks who is aware, perhaps for the first time in a very long time, that his words are being heard by someone who is both listening and taking notes. He picked up the card Marcus had placed on his bench. He looked at it for a moment. Then he rose. His robe swished. But the walk back toward his chambers was different from the walk he'd made into the courtroom 40 minutes ago, slightly less certain, slightly more careful. The walk of a man who has just been reminded that the floor can shift. The bailiff called, "All rise." The room rose. And in the back row, Marcus Avery rose with it. He rose the way he always rose when a judge exited a courtroom, not because he was required to, but because he had always believed that respect for the institution, even when the institution failed, was what separated the people trying to repair it from the people content to watch it burn. But he noted the difference between respect for the institution and acceptance of what certain men had made of it. He noted it with the same precision he noted everything. He was very good at noting things. He had built a career out of it. And the career, the badge, the office, the authority, the full freight of everything he had become, was about to enter this room in a way that courtroom 7B in Millhaven County and officers Pruitt. The recessed door closed behind Judge Calder. The room exhaled, and Marcus Avery reached into his overcoat and took out his phone and made the first of several calls that would, before the sun went down over Millhaven County, change the temperature of more rooms than one. The story has only just begun, because what happens in chambers is where the real courtroom happens, not the one with public benches and fluorescent lights and borrowed suits. The one where the men who built the system and the man who survived it and rose through it and now stands at its apex come face to face with the thing they both have to answer for. And before that, before we go behind that door, we need to understand who Marcus Avery is. Not the badge, not the title, the man, because the badge is just metal. What made the man is the story that the badge doesn't tell. And that story starts 34 years ago, on a Tuesday, in November, with a boy in a library and two men who never thought about him again. The walk to Judge Calder's chambers took 43 steps. Marcus counted, not from anxiety, from habit. The habit of a man who had learned early that paying attention to small things keeps you anchored when large things are trying to pull you loose. The bailiff led. Marcus followed. Behind him came Gerald Finch, the assistant district attorney, who had spent the walk rearranging his face into professional neutrality that wasn't quite working. Cynthia Park walked beside Marcus, not behind him, composed and forward-facing, revealing nothing. Calder's chambers smelled of old paper, wood polish, and the ghost of pipe tobacco that had decided to stay long after the habit left. The fishing photographs were exactly as Marcus had imagined, large, framed, positioned by a man who considered them evidence of something important about himself. Calder sat behind his desk without his robes. Smaller without them, not diminished,
Marcus
just still hadn't put
accurately
away.
sized.
Director Avery. The name handled carefully, like something newly understood to be sharp. Judge Calder. Marcus sat without being invited. He placed a thin folder on the desk. I'll be direct. He opened the folder, slid 3 pages across the mahogany surface. 14 months. 37 cases in this jurisdiction. 23 black defendants. 14 trials in your courtroom. The conviction rates, the evidentiary rulings, the sentencing disparities, taken together, they constitute what the DOJ Civil Rights Division classifies as a pattern of practice in violation of the 14th Amendment. Silence. That's a serious allegation, Calder said. It's a serious file. Marcus tapped the pages. The highlighted rows are your evidentiary rulings. The right column is the appellate reversal rate. He let that land. The dashcam footage in the Washington case. I watched it before I came here this morning. I also pulled Pruitt and Morse's complaint histories. 11 prior complaints between them. For use of force incidents. 0 disciplinary actions. Finch sat very still to the left. The stillness of a lawyer who has stopped trying to influence the direction of something and started calculating how far he is from where it lands. The word Officer Pruitt used in my presence, Marcus continued, is now part of an official federal transcript. Combined with this file, my office has sufficient grounds to open a formal civil rights investigation into the Mill Haven Police Department and this court. Calder removed his glasses. Set them down. He looked at Marcus, really looked, perhaps for the first time, with the attention of a man realizing what he's actually looking at. What is it you want, Director? Marcus leaned forward slightly. I want Exhibit 14D admitted. Today. And I want you to understand that this investigation happens in that courtroom in the next hour. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, a pigeon landed on the sill, regarded the scene briefly, and left, as if it had seen enough to make its own decision. Calder sat with the weight of 31 years pressing down through the chair beneath him. Then, I'll grant the motion. Yes, Marcus said simply. You will. When they walked back in, the room already knew something had shifted. You could feel it before a single word was spoken, in the way Pruitt's arms folded across his chest like a man bracing for impact, in the way Morse had gone completely still, in the way Patricia Washington's hands finally, quietly, released the Bible in her lap, as if she'd been holding her breath inside them for hours. Darnell was still staring at the table when the atmosphere changed. Tables tell you nothing, but rooms do. He looked up. He found Marcus Avery's eyes across the gallery. No nod. No signal, just steady, unflinching presence. The look of a man who has been exactly where you are standing and chose to come back for you. That was enough. Judge Calder settled at the bench, arranged his papers with the careful deliberateness of a man who is about to say something he would not have said 90 minutes ago and needs a moment to fully become the person who says it. Then, simply, cleanly, without ceremony, the motion is granted. The dashcam recording is admitted into evidence in its entirety. 11 words. Cynthia Park's pen stopped moving mid-sentence. In that stillness lived everything she hadn't allowed herself to feel across 3 denied motions and 6 weeks of a case that kept telling her the door was permanently locked. It wasn't relief yet. It was the sound of the lock finally turning, the first breath before the door actually opens. She wrote one word in her notepad. Marcus couldn't read it from the back row. But watching her shoulders drop one quiet inch. Finally, 6 weeks later, All charges against Darnell Washington were dismissed. Pruitt and Morse were placed on administrative leave pending federal review. Judge Calder's courtroom fell under federal oversight. The file with 37 names was opened formally by the DOJ Civil Rights Division. None of it made the national news. Most justice doesn't. It happens in hallways, in chambers, in the quiet reversal of a motion that should have been granted the first time. In a young man breathing freely at his mother's kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in December, hands flat on the wood, the weight finally gone. Marcus Avery was back at his desk in Washington before noon. He opened the next file. Because Darnell Washington was one name, the list had 36 more, and the man in the back row wasn't finished.